Thank you for joining me, everyone. Good afternoon. I love seeing the familiar names that I had just 2 weeks ago as we were diving into refining our skills with online pedagogies. For those of you who are new this time, I am Tanya Doucet. I am the Dean of the School of Education at the University of Alaska Anchorage. Just finished my first year here. I have been an associate professor and associate dean at the University of Idaho in the College of Education, Health and Human Sciences. I was the Docheo Center researcher while I was at Idaho as well. I've also been at the University of Wyoming. I've been in distance learning since 1999 when I was a little baby master's student at Texas A&M University. That was where I got to help create the first online doctoral programs. It was an EDD that was offered jointly between Texas A&M and Texas Tech University. And so it's been fantastic over the last 24 years, my goodness, looking at this transition for online. So when we flipped to emergency remote teaching, I was both thrilled and terrified as I watched what unfolded in front of us. So it's an honor and it's exciting to be able to share some of these practices with you. I'm going to jump into screen share. And Brittany, I'm going to ask you in the background to queue up the breakout rooms just like we did last time. We have a different question this time, but we'll be doing that again. So this time we are talking about practical guidance for online pedagogy and practices. Don't worry if you did not get to join us previously or have not yet had a chance to watch that recording. I do have a bit of a refresher baked in for us to go through. So our agenda for today, we're going to jump into some welcome and introductions. I've got a little breakout activity for us, just chatting about what our favorite technologies are or technology tool tips that we might want to share with our peers. Then we'll get into reviewing those strategies from our last webinar. Then we'll jump into some policies and procedures for practice. What you don't know can hurt you. So we'll take a look at some federal laws and some institutional policies that might be governing your decision-making. Then we'll explore 10 specific tools to facilitate that quality online engagement component. Then we'll wrap up and reflect, and you will get prepared for your next session with a wonderful colleague of mine, Dr. Anilda Romero Hall. So for our welcome and introductions, we're going to do breakout rooms. I'll take us out of screen share here in a moment to make it a little bit easier, but simply in 3 minutes, you're going to chat with your colleagues about your favorite tech tool or tip. So the example I give you in the little dialogue on screen, I love Google extensions. It's something that I use frequently. I use them for both my Chrome browser and for Google Drive apps themselves. YAM, yet another mail merge, is a Google Sheets extension or an add-on that I can use that lets me conduct mail merges. So if I have a spreadsheet with contact information or details about an event, then I can easily queue up a draft email in Gmail and use that spreadsheet to connect through, much like you might use Outlook connecting with Excel to conduct a similar activity. So in your groups, I would love for you about your favorite tech tool, and then we'll come back and share out quickly. There we go. Welcome back, folks. I gave us a little bit more time because we had a few folks join us late, so I wanted to put them into rooms and give them a chance to chat with folks. But now it's time to share out. So just really quick, I'd like at least 3 of our 5 rooms to share out one of the tech tips that came up in your room. Can I get some volunteers, or do I get to call on folks?
I'm not sure what our room number was, but we talked about using Camtasia and or Snagit to create videos to put into courses.
Thanks, Mary Lou. So you were in room 1. Camtasia is one of my favorites. I have used it for so much. And what I love to do now, I love to record segments in Zoom because then I can do all kinds of fun things with the whiteboard and not have to piece it together in Camtasia. But then I take it to Camtasia to trim it up and to use the transition or the annotations so that we can make the benefit or make the most use of our videos. So I'm going to type this one in the chat. Camtasia is the app. It's from TechSmith is the name of the company. They also produce Snagit, which is just a smaller screen recording. Camtasia is the larger video recording suite. Absolute fantastic tool. Love
Yeah,
it.
Snagit is nice because it's easier and you can do a real quick down and dirty video.
Yes.
You send one to a student or to somebody else. It takes 2 minutes to do, and
You can embed it in your email. It's wonderful. So if that students, they're lost, they can't find that place to click in the LMS to get to that quiz or that resource.
you throw it up into YouTube.
Yes.
You can throw it up into YouTube and you just send them the link.
Yep.
You know,
It's
you make
wonderful.
sure, yeah, so it's really nice. Yeah.
Thank you, Mary Lou, and thank you, room 1. So I'll jump to room 3. Deshauna, Dorothy, Emily, Laura, or Liza?
Talked about.
Hi, so this is Emily from John A. Logan Community College in Carterville, Illinois. So we are wide users of Teams here. We use it for internal and external meetings or different technology uses, but we've been expanding on those applications. We use D2L or Brightspace as our LMS, and then Teams, we can incorporate that in.
Wonderful. Thanks, Emily. Teams is a great integrated platform. And the way that it does work with SharePoint file sharing, I've actually been able to use it for a couple of multidisciplinary teams. I was on a book project administering distance learning with Lawrence Fuentes in New Mexico. And we had all of the authors in a team so that we could share our docs, look at our files, give peer feedback, and it was fantastic. I also used it on a research project. When I was at Idaho, we had a postdoc in Florida helping us. And one of my own doc students left the University of Idaho for a job with the federal government in California, but we were able to use Teams to keep working together and crank out our papers and our presentations. So great recommendation. Last one from rooms 2, 4, 5, or 6, a volunteer.
Hi, this is Cynthia. I'm from Malcolm X College, City Colleges of Chicago, and I'm not sure what my group number was, but we
You were 5.
Okay, we discussed videos, and someone reminded me about Google Docs, how sweet that is. But I teach respiratory, so I love to use the videos as backup content reinforcement or just to expand understanding. Easy to upload in the LMS and send to students, email, and things of that nature.
Absolutely. Thank you, Cynthia. We're going to talk a little bit about using Google Docs in a couple of ways today. So I'll touch on the video piece. A couple of years ago, I won an award from AECT, the Association for Educational Communications and Technology, for how I would use segmented videos to help my students. I would basically create one long video, but I would chop it up into 4 segments, and then I would use a final video, which was just the organizer. And that was at a time when you could use cards in YouTube and you could click on a screen and it would launch you to another video. So I used it as kind of a navigation mechanism. But I would have one video that was no more than 7 minutes long, and it was an introduction to the week's topic. What are we talking about this week, and how is it relevant to set that context and activate prior learning? The second video was anything that you might consider like a miniature lecture. Again, shorter than 10 minutes, focusing on length and span and knowing that students aren't going to be here for a 30-minute video. But what is the overview? What are you going to be doing this week? How does the content work together? And what am I expecting of you to set that tone? That third video was a checklist. What do you need to make sure you get done? So that way the students had the choice when they were launching into a new week or a new module. They were able to, what's the big picture and how does this fit into my schema as an adult learner? What is this precise unit or lesson or week focusing on? And what's the major content around it? And then what's my checklist? Is there a discussion I'm doing? Is there an activity? Is there a scaffolded something that I'm doing? Do I need to meet with somebody this week? That way I know I can pop back in and take a look at that quick checklist and know that I've gotten my stuff done for the week. So those are just a couple of tips, and thank you for letting me use your examples to share how I use these tools and hopefully help you think about ways that you might begin using these tools. So we'll jump back into screen share. And let's take a look at these strategies that I reviewed a couple of weeks ago with folks. So we had 5 key strategies. We began with looking at the community of inquiry and the 3 presences of the COI framework. So cognitive, social, and teaching. Now, when it comes to those 3 presences, we also had the ability to dig deeper into each one. What do they mean? How do they manifest in the classroom? And you gave me some feedback. You all completed a Google form telling me some ideas that you had about how you want to develop. And thank you for the link in the chat, Brittany. I want to point out that if you did not get to join us or would like to revisit, you can go back and look at the recording. So as you gave me feedback, or as you see that segment of the webinar, I noticed, and I went back to plan this webinar, what did you tell me you wanted to develop most? And it was cognitive. Your cognitive presence is what you as instructors want to develop and refine. So our cognitive presence is where we get into constructing meaning, facilitating discourse, and reflection. That component we need to, as learners, to take what we've just experienced and attach it to long-term memory so that we can retrieve it later and use it as we need it. So you'll see that this kind of fits together hand in hand. While the social presence and the teaching presence can manifest through the cognitive presence, we can see through these strategies how it all comes together. So communicating online. This is where we talked a little bit about how do we communicate in a traditional face-to-face environment versus how do we communicate in online spaces? How do those conversations that happen before class, during class, after class, between sessions happen when we take away that physical meeting space? And that can look like email announcements, course announcements, or email conversations, course announcements. It can look like using Microsoft Teams. It can look like using Discord or WhatsApp and creating other channels. There's a variety of ways that we transform that communication online. We even talked a little bit about video and audio, and you'll see some of those tools today as we talk about how do we actually apply these concepts. So the third component, or the third strategy that we looked at, was content activity flow. So this is where we talked about 3 approaches. Are you a front loader, where you are more or less giving all of the content to the information and the information to the students, and then they're expected to go and perform and do and practice? Then you might do some assessments. Or are you a flipper? Are you giving them the content before they come to class with you or before they meet with you in some way? And then when they're with you, you're engaging in that practice applicable component. Or are you an interweaver? Depending on your personality or even the content of the course, you might be one distinct identity. So as an interweaver, going back and forth. Sometimes it's a little bit of presenting content with a little bit of practice, and then you get into an assessment, but then you flow and you weave between the components of instructional design. Back to what I said a moment ago, it might be your personality. You prefer front loading or traditional lecture, or you prefer flipping, or you prefer interweaving. Or it might be that what you're teaching, the content, the modalities, and the learners demand something else in that moment. I started off as a front loader when I was an early instructor. I began to flip as I found the power of distance learning and had access to it. Now I prefer to interweave where I can, but depending on what I'm doing, the context, I might need to be a front loader. This presentation is very much a front-loaded presentation, front-loaded learning experience. But if you joined me the last time, 2 weeks ago, that was more of an interwoven strategy experience. So your content activity flow doesn't have to be fixed, but it might be if that's who you are. But think about how you can meet the demands of your learners by mixing up your strategies. The 4th strategy, scaffolding activities. This is where we talked about using smaller activities to build up to a final assessment or assignment. It could be brainstorming or building skills where they need to perform or do something at the end. So you have smaller scaffolded activities that build that skill set over time. Or maybe they're going to brainstorm. Maybe you want them to write a teaching philosophy. And so you have them use a mind mapping tool to brainstorm out the components of their teaching philosophy. Those are just different approaches to that scaffolding approach. And we even talked a little bit about how scaffolding can help us circumvent the challenges we see with tools like ChatGPT. If we just give a discussion prompt to a student, then absolutely, they can feed that through any AI generator, even if we ask them to design something visual. And they can generate something from AI and submit that as an assignment. But if we're using these scaffolded approaches, we're not going to have that happen as frequently because the students can't just feed a prompt. They have to engage with you and participate in that learning experience. So that participatory feel is how we make learning happen and make it relevant for students. The last component or last strategy that we talked about were novel assessments. And we talked about using peer feedback, collaborative construction, embedding reflection, and justifying their design decisions in that non-formal or novel assessment approach, so that it's embedding the reflection piece that we need for long-term learning success, but it's also building upon what they've been doing and creating this community of inquiry. So having that cognitive, social, and teaching presence. I'll take us out of screen share. Been watching the chat a little bit, loving the conversation, absolutely many assignments to prep for the final project. Thoughts or questions about those 5 strategies before we move on? Are we ready to dig into some of the policies and that guide what we do? Okay, policies it is. So this third section of today's webinar is focusing in on the policies and practice. So this is where we want to think about federal laws and institutional policies that govern our role with technology in the classroom. So this is where I'm going to ask you to use your reactions. Bottom of Zoom, little smiley face. You can give me any of the reactions that fit the questions I'm about to ask. How many of you are familiar with FERPA? Huzzah! Fantastic. Hopefully all of you, but at least you're aware, and maybe you don't know all of the ins and outs of FERPA, but most of us are required to take FERPA training on an annual basis. At the very least, we know that we should not be posting our students' grades and names on our doors. We'll go back in time when I was an undergraduate student. Put that in the chat for you, Mary Ellen. Give me 1 second. And you'll see this in the presentation as well, but FERPA, F-E-R-P-A. So once upon a time in 1995, when I wanted to go get my biology exam score, I had to trek across campus to my faculty member's office, and outside that office would be a sheet of paper with the last 4 digits of my social security number and the grade I got in my exam. And that's not going to work today because FERPA gives us as students rights, and we're going to talk about this. Second question, anybody familiar with COPPA, C-O-P-P-A? Ooh, bonus points for Mary. We're going to talk a little bit about these and why they're relevant. There's one more I'm going to give you. Anybody know CIPPA? Okay. So let's take a look at these 3 pieces of federal law that guide our practice with technology. FERPA, Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. This one passed back in '74. It has been updated multiple times since, but there's 4 key components that FERPA grants the rights to students for. Students can see any information that is kept about them, their grades, their notes, anything that you as a faculty member keep, anything that our software systems, our learning management systems, any technologies that collect data on your students, all of that is considered FERPA data. And a student has the right to request that information at any time. The second thing that a student can do with FERPA, they can seek to amend those records. So if there's anything in their documentation that they feel should be annotated or noted, They have a right to do that so that if someone else were to look at these records, the student voice is present. The third component of FERPA, the third right that FERPA grants to students, the consent to disclose records. Notice how the focus is on consent. By default, we cannot disclose information with another individual. So a familiar scenario, I remember hearing this play out often when I was a grad student, and I've seen it play out now as a faculty member after 10 years. A family member calls, a parent, a guardian, I'd like to know my student's my child's performance in your class. This isn't high school, this is college. They are 18 and the students have the right to their data. I can't speak to a parent or guardian without the student's permission unless they are a minor. It can get complicated at times, but that is the basic piece of the student consent. Now, a student also has the right to make all of their records private so that no one can even see directory information about this student. So that takes us to number 4. The student has a right to file a complaint if they are denied access. So number 1, if they are then denied the ability to amend their record, number 2, or if their privacy is breached, number 3. So this is where we have to be careful with some of the tools that we use and why and when we use them. I'll talk about FERPA as we keep going and look at our 10 specific tools so that you can be thinking about when I should be using this and when maybe I shouldn't be using this. The other 2 federal pieces of legislation here, COPPA and CIPPA, have an asterisk. So I'll show you here at the bottom of the screen. This is most relevant in a PK through 12 setting. But if you are an education preparation provider, if you are teaching teachers, if you are a teacher educator, you are modeling technology practices for future teachers, and they need to be aware about these policies, which means you need to be aware about these. So COPPA is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. It passed in 1998. And this is essentially what is the reason behind when you're logging into a platform for the first time and it asks you if you are 13 years of age or older. Because if it is collecting data on a minor who is under the age of 13, there are federal policies that apply. So COPPA essentially empowered the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, to issue and enforce online privacy regulations for children. If software that we're using is going to collect data on minors, that's where this comes into play. There are programs like Safe Harbor certification that can recognize compliance. So this is where, and I'll bring it back to some of our adult education classes. I know we have a mixture of elementary education and CTE folks in the audience. So if you're in the adult education world, it might be that you're working with someone to create an app. If they're going to create an app and those users of that app are going to be minors, they need to know about COPPA. If you're going to be working in a school district at all, so maybe you're going to work with students who are coming into CTE programs and they are a junior or a senior in high school, you will run into issues with COPPA, even though they are technically 17 or 18, they are still a high school student and COPPA will apply to their access to their district. So hopefully that helps with some of these connections and relevance pieces. On the CIPPA side, this is the Children's Internet Protection Act. The most common way that we see CIPPA in society is through internet filters. If you've ever tried to use a library computer or a school district computer to access a website and you were blocked, it's because of CIPPA. Again, to make this relevant, if you're a teacher educator, this is relevant for the tools you're modeling for your students. But if you're in the CTE or adult education world, you might be working with folks, and this is something that I run into all the time. I'm going to take us out of screen share real quick. Show of emotion reactions. Who likes to use bit.ly to shorten your links? bit.ly, or ever clicked on one? See a couple of thumbs ups. bit.ly is blocked on most school filtering software platforms. It is blacklisted because redlisted. Students have used bit.ly for years to circumvent filters. So they finally had to block bit.ly. So if I was working with a teacher, so if I were in grad school And I had a K-12 teacher who was in my master's program, and they were trying to access my resources from their school network. Sometimes the links would be blocked, which is why I had to know about CIPPA so that I could tell teachers, you need to access that through using your VPN to the university so that it's not being blocked on your school filter. Lynn-Ann, I see your hands up, so I want to give you a chance to speak. Okay.
I'm very glad, sorry about that. I'm very glad to know about Bitly because I had no idea. And we have a lot of dual credit students, so that's an incredibly important thing for me to remember. And I make
Yes. Thank you for that. That one does come into play frequently. There's a lot of the link shortening tools that are out there have all been blocked on school filters because of that problem. So if you run into an issue with students telling you that a link isn't working, it might be because they're accessing it from a network that's filtered, and CIPPA is what's at play. CIPPA also guides the need for digital literacy education. So we'll go back into screen share and I'll show you some resources that I love talking about with folks, whether you're in K-12 education or not, PK-12 or not. But Common Sense Media and Google both have resources. Oops, got to get back to my presentations here so I can launch your links for you. Should we share the whole screen? So really quick, Google has their Be Internet Awesome program. In the bottom right corner, you see this little panel feature for Explore Interland. This is a games-based approach to learning basic digital literacy. And it's things that we might be used to, like how to avoid phishing and scams. But remember, we have a whole generation of learners coming up who need to learn this. Common Sense Media is the other platform that or not platform, but resource that I recommend. Common Sense Education is a fantastic resource that lets you look at recommended apps, movies, video, audio for any age or any context, but they also have a digital citizenship curriculum that is completely free to adopt and use. So this is kind of fun. If you are teaching dual credit classes, there might be activities that you can integrate in and work with your students in that way. Questions or other thoughts about our federal policies? Okay, so let's take a look at institutional policies that guide our actions. Acceptable use. Most of us I've likely seen this on any software when we're installing it, or the first time we log into a network, or you are completing documentation or paperwork for your institution. Acceptable use is the agreement between an institution and its users in this context, so faculty, staff, students, or community patrons. It governs your actions for allowing use of any digital service or resource. Misuse can result in, at best, a slap on the hand, maybe a temporary suspension of access to that tool, or termination. A bit extreme, but this is where we can think about, we most commonly see the termination component come up in acceptable use if someone is doing something completely inappropriate, like running a gambling operation on a university server. Violation of acceptable use policy, you're likely going to get fired for that. Using software that violates student privacy, depends on what it is and how it violated the privacy. So that's what takes us to the second policy to think about. Your institution may or may not have a formal institutionally approved policy. This is a policy that provides guidance for reviewing and authorizing adoption of software, and it usually carries acceptable use penalties for using non-approved software. So let me give you an absolute extreme example here. Is anybody familiar with the platform Top Hat? Okay. Top Hat is an integrated learning platform that can help bring in dynamic textbooks that are digital and have videos. I see Yolanda's got her thumb up here. So it can integrate quizzes with lectures, with reading. It's got chat features built in. Sounds like a really cool platform, right? It's also got a lot of tracking and privacy concerns with it, and a number of institutions have banned it from use. However, that didn't stop Top Hat sales folks during COVID from reaching out directly to faculty across the country saying, have you seen our tool? It could help you in your class during these trying times. And so faculty started adopting the use of Top Hat without checking with their institution to see if it was approved. It happened to us at the University of Idaho. It had been explicitly banned as a tool by our IT folks. And we had a number of faculty who just got a slap on the hand, but it identified a need that we needed to let faculty know that there's a website from IT. Sometimes it's a knowledge base, or sometimes it's under your Center for Teaching and Learning, but it will list all of the variety of tools that are acceptable for use that have been approved. And there's usually a way for you to request use of a new tool. I'll talk about that as we jump into the tools we're going to look at, which is up next. So before we jump into those, any questions about federal laws or university policies? Quick show of hands. Was this new information for you? Or was it a refresher? Okay. Thank you. So let's take a look at those 10 tools. I have these broken up into 4 categories, and you'll see that these connect back to the strategies that we talked about in our previous webinar. So for scaffolding activities, I'm going to recommend bubble.us and Lucidchart, and we're going to dig into each of these tools one by one real quick. For peer feedback, I recommend Google Docs or Word 365, depending on the outfit or the ecosystem that you're in, and Google Sheets plus Forms or Excel 365 and Microsoft Forms. If we're talking about embedded reflections, that's where I like to lean on VoiceThread and Flip. Now, if we're talking about collaborative construction, and I'm going to put a little asterisk here, we're going to talk about Jamboard, Padlet, Hypothesis, and Perusal. Now that asterisk, collaborative construction, you could also do that with Bubble. You could also do that with Google Docs. So some of these tools aren't just set within one of these 4 boxes. We can use tools in a variety of ways. So don't let how I've organized them box you in to how you plan to use them. So first up, we've got bubble.us. Now, this is why it's super important to make sure we share the slides with you, because you'll see each of these slides is laid out the same way with a hyperlink to the website to get to the tool, a link to the help or support for that tool, and a link to the getting started, the training, the introduction, so that if it is a new tool for you, you can get started. If it's a tool you're used to using, but maybe you could use some help with something you were trying to get done, you've got support, but everybody will have access. So for bubble.us, and I've got my chat pulled up, can I get a text confirmation if you're, or what you're seeing, bubble.us or slides?
Bubble.us.
Fabulous, thank you. So here is the Bubble website. You can sign in, register all these pieces. This is your easy one-step access. But back to our slides, I've also got a caution for you. So what to know about using this particular tool? Saving or editing a map in Bubble requires an account. So that is something to keep in mind. There is a freemium model of using Bubble. Freemium meaning there is a free level, but it limits you to 3 mind maps. So if this is a tool that you intend to use more extensively, you might want to see if your institution has it available or recommend it for use. There is a 50% discount available for education. Otherwise, you can use it as I've used it over time. I ask my students to create 1 mind map in a class. And at the end of the class, I remind them that they can delete or recycle that mind map if they need to use this tool for another class or for a personal project. I also give them the option of using something other than Bubble since it is not technically approved and I can't require its use. Lucidchart is another of my favorite tools. So again, here's your website. Here's your help link, and here's the diagram center, which has all of their tutorials to get you started. We're going to click into the website real quick. And you can see that this is more of a diagramming tool that is a bit more heavy hitting than Bubble. Now we're not just talking about mind maps. We could do floor plans and diagrams and all kinds of layouts with Lucidchart. So some example uses: technical diagrams, illustrating a fictional or non-fictional scene, or designing graphical organizers. I want to highlight that this was also available on Bubble, and it has many of the same example uses. So constructing an association map in Bubble, you could do that in Lucidchart. It's not that they're not the same, but it was also trying to mix it up to give you some suggestions of what you can do. The cautions with Lucidchart: individual accounts are free for students and teachers if you use your institutional email address to sign up. The interface, however, can be a little bit overwhelming because it is more of a technical tool. And it can also be a bit confusing when you're sharing and exporting files, but it is a really great tool for diagrams and flowcharts, especially if you're in a CTE area that has students mapping or diagramming out decisions. Google Docs, this one came up earlier in our icebreaker session. So access and support, straight to the Google Docs website or Google Docs support, the link to their training and help. Because we're talking about these two interchangeably, I give you the links for both Google Docs and Microsoft 365. I also give you a link to this handy little sheet from Google that shows you if you're in Word and you wanted to do something, here's how you would do it in Docs. Or similarly, if you're moving from Docs back to Word. So this can be a great resource for you or your students who might be living in multiple ecosystems. So this is where I want to take us out of screen share and ask quickly, who lives in a Google ecosystem in your university or has access to Google through your university? Got a couple? Okay. So instead of a thumb, we'll do the clapping. Who's on Microsoft? Okay. Now give me the heart if you have access to both. Yes, that's me. So this is something to pay attention to when we're working in these ecosystems. When I was at Idaho and Wyoming, both of those were purely Microsoft ecosystems, but I was working with Wyoming to help them bring Google in. We wanted access to Classroom for our pre-service teachers because all of our K-12 districts were using Google Classroom and they needed to be able to see it and use it as a teacher, not just a student. At Alaska, we have access to both, and it's very helpful and useful. We ran into issues in Idaho in particular, and I had to help our faculty understand that while we were a Microsoft school, 86% of Idaho K-12 districts, public districts, use Google. So the students were coming to us with this Google experience and using Google Docs to write all their papers and slides to do all their presentations, turning those in, and faculty were getting frustrated because they were using Microsoft. So these are just little nuances to pay attention to in our different ecosystems. Back over to our presentation. So example uses for Google Docs and Word 365 in this particular aspect, we're talking peer feedback, remember. So iterative peer commenting or editing of a draft document, structured asynchronous narrative discussion, or even collaborative authoring. So in talking about iterative peer commenting, this is where you could have students completing a draft of an assignment, and then a peer goes in and uses the suggesting mode of Google Docs, or they're in the reviewing mode of Word to track changes and leave comments to give peer feedback on that artifact. In a structured asynchronous narrative discussion, you can have discussion prompts embedded in a document and have students responding using color coding or some other way to identify who's responding in the document at that time. Similarly, collaborative authoring. I love having students co-write something together or co-create in a Google Doc. just to bring meaning and value to what we're working on. So the caution here, Google tools may or may not be approved for use, what we were just talking about a minute ago. And then Word does not handle the real-time collaboration seamlessly every time. This is one frustration I had using Microsoft Teams for those collaborations. Occasionally we would end up with conflicted copies of documents because of the way Microsoft syncs to the cloud versus the way Google syncs, where it will merge versions together and keep moving along, but give you access to that version history if you need it. Similarly, you can use sheets and forms. Just like I had a link for Word and Doc, there's a link here for Sheets and Excel that will let you compare the two and what you're trying to do in one and how you would do it in the other. Example uses in this case, you could use a survey, so a form from either Google or Microsoft to collect feedback in a survey form and feed that back out to your students. That can help with a blind review process if you're trying to keep comments blinded and not let students know who was reviewing their work. And I love doing that in graduate level courses in particular, if we're going to facilitate something like a blind peer review. And I play the editor role. And then at the end of the entire project, not only do the students turn in their draft, they have to turn in that editor's response where they're telling me, how did you respond to the feedback you received from your peers? You can use these surveys to facilitate signups. If you're trying to form groups, it's a great way to get these going. You can formatively assess progress. So this is where you can do what I did in the previous webinar. And I had those 3 little questions that were asking you to give me feedback on how you were feeling and what you needed to develop. The 4th idea is formatively evaluating your learning design. I have done this every year for more than 15 years in higher education. At the midterm, I push out a simple survey. I've used Google Forms and Microsoft Forms for this, but the first question is, what do you love the most about class? The second question is, what do you like the least about class? And the third question is, what do you wish you could change? I take the raw comments, submissions to those questions. I feed them back to my students in a discussion in the following week. And if there's anything that we can change as a learning community, we do change. That's where I have done things over the years, like I changed a class meeting time. Came into the University of Idaho, I inherited when that class was supposed to meet. It was on Tuesday nights at 5:30, and the students hated it. Everybody was available at 4. I got permission from the university to move class to 4 p.m. on Tuesdays and made everybody happy. So these are great tools to use in a variety of ways for our teaching. Again, Google tools may or may not be approved for use, and Microsoft Forms are not easily modified after you've collected responses. I'll also note that there's more functionality with Google Forms because there's other add-ons in the Google ecosystem that can make them powerful. I mentioned facilitating signups. I've had signups for students where they need to pick a topic to give a report on or to research. And I want 2 students to do this, or 1 student, and you can have a countdown on a Google form that if a selection has been made X number of times, it disappears from the list. And so I can have 10 items, I have 10 students, and if you're the last student, then you only get the last option because everybody's taken the others from you. The next tool that we'll quickly talk about is VoiceThread. So again, your links are on the left over here. Example uses: audio or video-based reflections, asynchronous video or audio-based discussions, narrating a presentation, or practice speaking. If you are helping with extemporaneous speaking, if you're teaching a language learning class, these are fantastic. This is a fantastic tool for that. VoiceThread also lets you as a faculty member narrate your presentations if that's something of interest and you don't want to use a tool like the Zoom recording feature or Camtasia. But some cautions. Institutional and personal accounts are available. A free personal account is limited to 5 voice threads. So something to keep in mind, like we talked about earlier with the bubble tool. There is also a potential integration with an institutional LMS. So some universities have gone in on VoiceThread, and this is certainly one to ask IT or a Center for Teaching and Learning about to see if you have access. But along these lines, you could also use Flip. Flip is owned by Microsoft. It is completely free, but you can do the same thing. audio or video reflections, your discussions. In this case, you're going to narrate a brief presentation. In the cautions, I help highlight over here that is a 10-minute maximum recording length in Flip versus VoiceThread, which gives you, I think I've seen up to an hour at least. But you can also use your internet or your university single sign-on for Flip. If you have a Microsoft single sign-on and your institution allows it, this can integrate seamlessly for those uses. Into those collaborative construction tools. So we used Jamboard previously in the other webinar. I've also got Whiteboard on here. There is a Microsoft Whiteboard alternative. However, let's jump to the cautions. There are significantly limited editing capabilities in Jamboard that you get with the Microsoft Whiteboard. You also have limited screen space in a Jamboard that you're not limited to in a Microsoft Whiteboard. On the flip side, while Jamboard integrates easily with other Google apps and tools, Whiteboard from Microsoft does not integrate easily with the other Microsoft ecosystem tools. So something to just be aware of. But this is where you can have students gather and sort concepts, project ideas, lecture notes. They can create a graphic organizer. You can facilitate a discussion, or you can actually sketch note a lecture and have students sketchnoting together. Padlet is another of my favorite tools, similar to a Jamboard. So you can do the same thing with gathering and sorting concepts. You can design your graphic organizers. You can also curate collections. An example of how I've used Padlet recently with my secondary science education students, we've curated a large pad in Padlet that is all kinds of different science concepts that are controversial in some contexts. It might be teaching evolution. It might be flat earth theory. It might be the scientific method. But we've got a complete Padlet built out with these different concepts and then resources beneath each one that the students have pulled together on how would you address this? How would you communicate with a parent? Or how would you teach this particular concept to someone who may disagree with? And so this is a different way that you can curate with Padlet. Similar caution as some of our other tools. It has a freemium model. There's a free level, but you only get 3 Padlets. There is institutional pricing available, but this is where I want to highlight that this particular tool is not accessibility friendly. So if you have students using screen readers, Padlet can give it a lot of trouble. The other tools that we've talked about can work with accessibility in different ways, but this is the most problematic to think about. Hypothesis is a fantastic tool. We're going to look at its counterpart here in a moment, but Hypothesis is fantastic for annotations on notes or creating a bibliography or working through to generate an annotated bibliography of sorts. You can collaboratively annotate for a facilitated discussion as well. That's how I used Hypothesis last summer, just about this time, actually. I was teaching a class on a special topics in distance learning foundations and research. And I had a series of articles that the students were reading each week. And so I went into these articles and I preceded, rather than using the discussion board, I preceded my discussion questions throughout the PDF of the article. So as I would get to a particular concept, I would add my annotation, and then the students would come back into the LMS and they would read the article and then they would add their reply. And so the students could all see how we were all responding to that one section of the article. And then I didn't have to have a bunch of different discussion threads. Everything was contained in that one PDF. And now we all have that PDF and we can all see those annotations to help us as we continue to grow in our practice and skills. The caution with Hypothesis, it works with documents and websites only, and it is free if you are using it in a non-integrated LMS way. Notice that a second ago I mentioned LMS. I was loading the PDFs as files into my LMS, and the students were installing the Hypothesis app to use it on their computers, and we were synced in the Hypothesis server and saving our comments. Excuse me, I'll note that I also had to be careful not to have anything in the comments that related back to the University of Idaho, and that's how I helped the FERPA concern. There was nothing about the annotations in this document or our student accounts that could be breached and identify that as a student in a class at a university. The other tool that's like Hypothesis is called Perusal. There's your links on the left, same example uses, annotating for notes or a bibliography or a collaborative discussion. Perusal is a much more powerful tool than Hypothesis. It works with more than just websites and documents. You can use it with media and digital textbooks, so it can integrate significantly with other tools. And there are free accounts with institutional licensing available. Woo! Anybody else tired? That was like a sprint. Favorite tool that I just mentioned, or a tool that you want to explore, hit me in the chat with it. Love it. Flip and VoiceThread, yes. I've used Flip for all kinds of things. Actually, during COVID, we used Flip at Idaho to curate a congratulatory message board for our graduates. We secretly did this behind the scenes. I got all of the faculty to record messages in a Flipgrid, and then we sent that out to our graduates by email as a card so that they could see messages from us since we didn't have commencement that year. Awesome. Love it. Lucidchart, Lynn, it's one of my favorites. And actually at the very end, you'll see the cover of one of the books I've co-authored. All of the diagrams that are in that book, I created with Lucidchart because it gave me high-res images for that. So let's wrap up our discussion and take some questions if you've got a few extras. I want to leave us with this thought that good learning design leads to good learning outcomes. Our focus is on online pedagogies and practices, but we can use these tools in a variety of contexts, and we use them effectively, then we're practicing good learning design, and that's what's going to give us good learning outcomes, not the modality. So as we reflect, you've all just told me what are the tools that you want to play with. What's the first one? So you're already thinking about which one of these tools or which combination of these tools will help you meet your personal goals to building a community of inquiry, to enhancing your online teaching practice. So now you need to think about what's the professional development you need to effectively use these tools, and when do you plan to integrate these tools? Because that's going to tell you how much time that you have available. It's the summer. I hope you have some opportunities over the next couple of weeks to dig into these tools. If you are interested in playing with Google a bit more, the Google Training Center is a fantastic place to dive into. It is really easy to work your way through the Google Level 1 and Level 2 educator training programs. If you take the test at the end, the price total is now $40. It's $15 for one, I think, and $30 for the other. And you can get your badges. And now you've got your Google Level 1 and Level 2 educator badges, which I can honestly say helps me when I work with K-12 school districts using those tools. Microsoft has similar programs, and a number of these platforms have ambassadors who are influencers on social media or who produce videos on YouTube that will show you what you want to do quickly so that you don't have to dig through the help files. But what questions might you have about the previous webinar or this webinar? Go. And that's a great question, Amy. How many tools would I suggest using in a semester? Please don't give your students tool whiplash. It's very easy to go, oh, shiny object. I want to use this and this and this. There's a time and a place for our tools. So as you think about what's the activity you want to do, you can help your students if you do that activity over and over with the same tool. And by that, I mean, every time you want to do a video reflection or an audio reflection, have them use VoiceThread or Flipgrid. Don't mix it up. Now you can give them choice. So I'm a big fan of universal design for learning. So when I do these assignments, I build them out so that students have the choice of giving me a video reflection, an audio reflection, or a written reflection. And then it's 1 page written or 1 minute and 30 seconds recorded is what I give them the parameters for. And so that gives students the ability to choose how they're reflecting, but don't mix it up and don't use all the tools. Try to stick to, if you're going to like use Google Docs, or Microsoft, use Flipgrid, VoiceThread and Google Docs, try to keep it pared down so that you're not sending them all over the place to get to tools. Thanks, Amy. Brian. Edpuzzle. Edpuzzle is a fun one. It is fantastic, especially when you're working with pre-service teachers, and you can use videos and create short videos with those little quizzes. I wouldn't say flaws per se, but there are some bugs that can pop up. Edpuzzle is one that has a fantastic teacher community, though, that will help you with either the workaround or I want to build an Edpuzzle that does this, and somebody will have the instructions and template for you. Other tools. No, I don't believe it does, but I'm trying to remember what studio shifted towards, and I'm not remembering. I'm so sorry that I can't recall at the moment, but it's not Flip. It was something else. So let's take it from a different question. Does anybody have an activity that they would like to do, but they're not sure what tool to use for it? Well, then I'll leave you with this challenge. As you look at the classes you're going to be designing and teaching or updating for the next semester, if you run into a challenge, if you're like, I'm just not sure which tool would be the better tool for this, please feel free to reach out to me. I love helping to brainstorm. Learning design is probably both a hobby and a job. So anytime someone comes to me and they want to know tools or they want to know who's using what, I am so happy to work with you on that. And thank you, Lynn, Screencastify. And that's what changed. Thank you. I knew it wasn't Studio. Brittany, anything we'd like to share? Do we want to promote the next webinar with Anilda?
Yeah, absolutely. Brian, I think, has another question, so I'll let him go and then I'll share out.
Aha, accessibility. Yes. Accessibility was the one thing I directly mentioned in one tool. Edpuzzle, if I recall, has some accessibility concerns, but let me double check. I've got a great colleague who uses Edpuzzle all the time. So Brian, if you could DM me an email address, I will get you a direct answer on that.
Okay, so if anyone has any more questions, feel free to type those in the chat while I'm talking. But we do have another session coming up on, I believe it's June 15th at 10:30 with Dr. Anilda Romero Hall, and she will be discussing with us learner-centered and culturally relevant approaches to online teaching and learning. I will share out the description and more information, as well as the link for registration when I share the recording and resources from today's session. But again, just another deeper dive into online pedagogy and the different elements that can play into that and the forms that can take place. Because again, with with the pandemic, we all moved online, and now there are benefits and amazing things that, teaching online can do, but how to best use it to our benefit and to the benefit of the students. And so that's really what these sessions and the upcoming sessions are really about.
Thank you, Brittany. And I'm happy to hang for some one-on-one questions. I don't mind homework, really. But thank you for joining me.
Okay, so we'll do one last call for questions, and then we will go ahead and close out for the day and let everyone get back to their afternoon.
Thank you, Brittany. Glad to help, Amy.
I'm sorry, this is Deb Valentine. How are you?
I'm doing good, Deb. How are you?
I just had a quick question when you were talking about some of the regulatory requirements. I was wondering about the TEACH Act.
Let me think about how TEACH intersects here.
Because it's like copyrights and how much you can use.
Right. I remember it. So if I remember correctly, TEACH is going to affect more of the content that we're bringing in than the tools that we're using. But it can come into play with like using hypothesis. So definitely when it comes to the copyright component, it does help us with that educational use, but I would check in with your Center for Teaching and Learning and your library services.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all very much. And Tanya, thank you so much. It's been a great 2 webinars and great information. So thank you very much for sharing with us.
Thanks, Brittany. Have a great afternoon.